Attila the Hun needed no surname, no dynasty, no city to be remembered. 14 centuries after his death, his name still functions in a dozen languages as shorthand for total, civilization-ending destruction. A linguistic afterlife shared by almost no other historical figure of comparable antiquity. Roman writers called him the Scourge of God, a title so effective at capturing Western imagination that it outlived the empire that coined it by well over 1,000 years. Medieval chroniclers blamed him for the collapse of an empire that had already been failing for a century before he was born, layering onto his memory sins that predated his existence by generations. Modern Hungarian nationalism, meanwhile, has spent the last 200 years trying to claim him as an ancestor rather than a villain, a founding hero rather than an apocalypse with a face, a rehabilitation project built on remarkably little actual evidence in either direction. Both versions of Attila the Destroyer and the Founder were built almost entirely on legend, because the historical record left behind by the Huns themselves amounts to almost nothing. No Hunnic written language survives. No Hunnic city has been excavated with confidence. Everything we thought we knew came from the people who feared them, which is not generally where reliable history comes from. In 2022, a genuinely large-scale ancient genome study finally gave researchers a way to test the legend against the bones. What it found reshapes not just who the Huns were, but how an entire nation understands where it came from. The Huns appear in Roman and Greek sources with startling suddenness in the late 4th century CE, already a fully formed military threat by the time anyone bothered to write about them in detail. Ammianus Marcellinus, the Roman historian closest in time to their arrival in Europe, described them as a people who had emerged from some remote corner beyond the frozen Maeotic marshes, riders so inseparable from their horses that Roman writers half believed they ate and slept in the saddle. A people whose sudden appearance on the Pontic steppe triggered a chain reaction of displaced populations. Goths fleeing across the Danube, Vandals and Alans pushed westward, the entire architecture of the late Roman frontier destabilized within a single generation by a force nobody in the Mediterranean world had previously encountered or understood. Where they had come from before that sudden appearance remained, for over a millennium, almost entirely speculative. The most persistent theory, floated since the 18th century and repeated in various forms ever since, connected the European Huns to the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that had dominated the eastern steppe and repeatedly clashed with Han Dynasty China centuries earlier, before disappearing from Chinese historical records. Around the same general era, the Huns began appearing in European ones. The theory was linguistically appealing. Hun and Xiongnu share a certain phonetic resemblance when filtered through several rounds of ancient transliteration across Chinese, Central Asian, and eventually Latin and Greek sources. But it rested almost entirely on timing and geography rather than anything resembling direct evidence, and serious historians spent 2 centuries arguing about it without ever settling the question, some dismissing the connection outright as coincidental phonetics dressed up as history. Attila himself built an empire on the strength of this mysterious, sudden arrival, uniting a coalition of steppe warriors and absorbed Germanic subject peoples into a military force that extracted tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, invaded Gaul, and ravaged northern Italy before his death in 453 CE, after which his sons fractured the empire so quickly and so completely that within a generation the Hunnic political entity had essentially ceased to exist as an organized power in Europe. The people vanished from the historical record almost as abruptly as they had entered it. The genetic study that finally tested this 11th-century-old mystery against hard evidence was published in 2022 in the journal Current Biology, led by researchers including Zoltan Marodi and Andrei Neporoksky, working with archaeological material spanning an enormous geographic and chronological range. Hun period burial sites in the Carpathian Basin, comparative samples connected to the later Avar period, and, critically, ancient genomes recovered from Xiongnu period sites on the eastern steppe, allowing the team to directly test the connection that historians had been arguing about since before genetics existed as a science. The results confirmed something real behind the old theory. though with far more nuance than either side of the historical debate had generally assumed. A subset of individuals buried at confirmed Hun period sites in the Carpathian Basin showed genetic ancestry connecting directly back to the Xiongnu period populations of the eastern steppe, including some individuals whose genetic profile matched extremely closely with elite Xiongnu burials thousands of miles to the east. A genuine traceable thread connecting the European Huns to the nomadic empire that Roman writers had never heard of and Chinese chroniclers had already stopped writing about a century before Attila's birth. But that eastern steppe genetic signal did not appear uniformly. The Hun period population buried in the Carpathian Basin showed remarkable genetic heterogeneity. Individuals ranging from strong Eastern Asian steppe ancestry to profiles genetically indistinguishable from the local European populations the Huns had conquered or absorbed along their westward migration, with a wide spectrum of mixed ancestry filling the space between those two extremes. This was not a single, genetically uniform people who had marched intact from Mongolia to Hungary. It was a coalition, built and rebuilt across generations of steppe migration, absorbing Sarmatian, Germanic, and other populations at every stage of a journey that likely took multiple centuries rather than happening in one dramatic wave. This finding matters enormously for understanding what Attila's empire actually was, as opposed to what Roman fear and later legend made it. The Hunnic confederation that terrorized the late Roman world was never an ethnically singular invading horde in the way medieval chroniclers and later popular imagination both preferred to imagine. It was a genuinely composite military and political structure, drawing manpower and leadership from multiple steppe and European populations that had been absorbed, allied with, or conquered across generations of westward movement, unified by shared military organization and political loyalty to a ruling dynasty rather than by any single shared ancestry. This pattern, once identified, helps explain something that had always been slightly strange about Attila's court as Roman diplomats described it. Priscus, a Roman envoy who actually visited Attila's camp and left one of the only first-hand eyewitness accounts of Hunnic society to survive, described a polyglot world of Hunnic, Gothic, and Latin speakers, Germanic subject kings serving alongside steppe warriors, and a ruling elite that had clearly absorbed enormous cultural and political material from the very peoples it had conquered. Genetics now confirms this was not simply cultural absorption layered on top of an ethnically uniform Hunnic core. The biological reality was mixed from a very early stage, generations before Attila was even born. The connection to the Xiongnu carries its own significant weight, because it resolves a genuine two-century academic argument with actual physical evidence rather than linguistic speculation. The Xiongnu Confederation had dominated the eastern steppe from roughly the 3rd century BCE, built fortified settlements, extracted tribute from Han Dynasty China through a combination of raiding and negotiated treaty, and then fractured under internal pressure and Chinese military campaigns beginning in the 1st century CE, with various successor groups scattering westward across the vast intervening steppe corridor over the following centuries. The genetic thread the 2022 study identified connecting elite Xiongnu burials to specific Hun period individuals in Hungary does not mean the entire Hunnic population descended directly from Xiongnu nobility. It means that somewhere within the multi-generational migration and coalition-building process that eventually produced Attila's empire, a genuine traceable line of descent from the historical Xiongnu elite survived the roughly 4,000-mile journey and multiple centuries separating the two societies, carried forward by at least some of the families that eventually formed part of the Hunnic ruling structure in Europe. The old theory was not wrong. It was simply far less simple than either its proponents or its critics had assumed for 200 years of argument. The study's third major contribution extends the genetic story past Attila's death and into a period with direct consequences for how millions of people today understand their own national origins. Hungary's foundational national narrative holds that the Magyars, the Finno-Ugric-speaking horsemen who conquered the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century CE and founded the kingdom that eventually became modern Hungary, arrived as conquering successors to a landscape the Huns had already shaped centuries earlier. A narrative that has, at various points in Hungarian history, been used to draw a direct symbolic line from Attila to the modern Hungarian state, reflected in everything from the continued popularity of Attila as a given name to 19th century nationalist historiography that explicitly framed the Magyar conquest as a homecoming rather than a fresh arrival. The genetic sampling from Avar period and early Magyar period sites, examined alongside the Hun period material in the same study, shows genuine population continuity and repeated genetic contact between successive steppe-descended populations, settling the Carpathian Basin across the intervening 4 centuries between Attila's death and the Magyar conquest. Evidence that the region never fully lost its connection to the broader Eurasian steppe world during that gap, even as political control passed through Hunnic, Germanic, Avar, and finally Magyar hands. This does not prove direct unbroken descent from Attila's own bloodline to any specific modern Hungarian population, a claim the evidence cannot currently support at that level of genealogical precision. But it does demonstrate that the symbolic connection modern Hungarian identity draws to the steppe warriors of late antiquity rests on a genuine underlying pattern of repeated Eurasian steppe migration into the same territory, rather than being pure invented tradition layered onto an unrelated population. 14 centuries of legend built Attila into 2 irreconcilable figures, annihilating scourge and heroic founder, using almost exactly the same handful of second-hand Roman accounts to construct both versions. The genetic evidence recovered from Hun period graves in the Carpathian Basin cannot settle which legend was closer to the man himself, because legends were never really about the man. What the DNA can do, and has now done, is confirm the deeper architecture beneath both stories, a genuinely composite steppe empire, built from Xiongnu descendants, absorbed Sarmatians, conquered Germanic tribes, and generations of intermarriage across a migration corridor 4,000 miles long, unified not by blood but by the political and military machine that Attila's dynasty built on top of all of it. The horses are gone. The empire lasted barely 20 years past Attila's death before it came apart in his son's hands, fractured by the same coalition politics that had built it in the first place. What remains, written into bone rather than legend, is a population history considerably stranger and more interconnected than either the Roman nightmare or the Hungarian founding myth ever needed it to be. Proof that the most feared cavalry in the ancient world rode not out of some ethnically pure and distant homeland, but out of centuries of steppe peoples finding each other, absorbing each other, and building something new every single time the grassland pushed them further west. Somewhere in that 4,000-mile chain of migration and mixture, an empire that terrified Rome and later inspired an entire nation's founding story was assembled piece by piece, generation by generation, out of exactly the kind of scattered, blended ancestry that the legend on both sides always insisted it couldn't possibly have had.